Andrea, are you ready to start?
Yes, I am.
Great, thank you.
Let me know when. Leo Simchaniabo Mawayim, very good morning for me, afternoon or evening or night for everybody that's joining us. I welcome the members of the Facilitative Working Group to our second session for our third formal meeting of Facilitative Working Group for the Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform. I have been notified by Rodian that he will not be in the meeting today because of our urgent situation. He has to return to his home village and will be traveling. He's going to check to see if his alternate can be on the line. I'm not sure if she is or not yet, but she can let us know if she does join. So I just wanted to inform people that he will not be joining us today. I know we have participation from literally all over the world, and I welcome those that are listening on the live stream as well. And thank you very much for your interest, as well as those who are participating as observers. And to remind you again that we will make every effort to include your feedback, your considerations, your comments and questions. Yesterday, there were two ways that we were getting those. One was on the chat function, and one was in the participants function. There is a raise hand button. And I encourage the members of the Facilitative Working Group to keep your videos on. And if you want, you can just like show me a raised hand. And I'm saying good morning on behalf of the two co-chairs. Yao is also here, and we've divided up the meeting so that I will chair until the break, and then he will take over the chairmanship. And please provide any feedback, notes, private comments, something that we overlooked or forgot. Please provide on the chat. I would very much like to turn over the floor to the Secretariat at this point to see if there's any considerations they feel that we should take into account before the beginning of the meeting. So Tiffany or others, members of the Secretariat, please comment at this time and guide us as you've been doing. And thank you so much to all of you too. It's invaluable, your help and guidance.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. Just another reminder that we are recording the session, like we said yesterday, and that if possible, the FWG members should put on their cameras so that Andrea can see if you're waving. And for all of our other contributors, you feel free to put your name into the chat that if you'd like to speak, and then we can note it for Andrea. Or if you don't want to do that, you can also push the little raise hand button. But it's a little bit easier for us if you do put your name in the chat, and then we know the order of speakers. But for FWG members, please do raise your hands and wave at Andrea if you do have your camera on. Thank you.
I'm going to turn over the floor for some introductory remarks from my co-chair. But first of all, on my behalf, I will say that I think all of us shared the recognition of the incredible amount of work that has been done by this constituted body, despite the challenges. We recognized yesterday there were some holes in our work that we were not able to carry out virtually, but almost everybody has been able to especially the co-leads of the different activities have been able to adjust to the pandemic and transform their work into virtual formats, both recognizing the shortfalls of not being in personal connection face to face, as well as the opportunities that this new Zoom experience is providing in some ways increasing the ability for participation from around the world. in a way that doesn't require plane tickets, visas, and hotel rooms, etc. So, of course, we look forward to coming back together and recognize also the losses that we've suffered, including many of our elders and knowledge holders, at least in our part of the world, but also thank everybody for their flexibility and commitment in carrying out the work that we'll continue to discuss and share with each other and with all of the participants as we move through these next 3 days. So with that, I'd like to turn over the floor to Yo to see if you have any opening comments as the co-chair before we begin the first agenda item.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Not much to add. You spoke very well for all of us, welcoming everyone. I just wanted to echo the gratitude for your active participation, everyone's active participation and substantive contributions so far. And I look forward to more today and the next couple of days as well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll begin by focusing on activity 4, the annual training workshops. And we have a half an hour to discuss this item. I would like to turn over the floor to Daly, who I understand is one of the co-leads along with Eli for this activity. And in particular, there was a revision to the original concept note in light of the online format that we're focusing on now until we can meet again in person. And she maybe could provide some updates on that, on the series of webinars and the progress to date. And I note here on the agenda, there will be an opportunity, if requested by the co-leads, for the members to provide other suggestions as we progress. So Daly, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to acknowledge that my colleague and the new alternate for the FWG, Lisa Kopekulak, an Inuk from Nunavik, is online and joining us for the meeting. And also, before I begin, just like to thank Eli and Tom Cameron as the co-leads. It's been a pleasure to work with them, and also to acknowledge Joanna McDonald, who has been an invaluable asset to all of our work, including this particular activity. The first item I'd like to reference is that the issue of Indigenous peoples versus local communities, I felt was very well addressed in the concept note. Everybody has the concept note, so I'm not going to go over it in great detail, but I think it's important. It certainly was important to us as co-leads, but also to Indigenous peoples, that there be a distinction made between Indigenous peoples and local communities. And that was certainly done in the context of this particular concept note. As noted in the concept note, you will have not only the actual training webinars and a series of 4 training webinars, and you see the way that they have been at least structured in broad contours and as far as the content is concerned. But we also wanted to ensure that in the future there's an opportunity for an in-person training. And though the in-person training will not repeat or duplicate everything that takes place in the series of 4 training webinars, but will provide us with an opportunity to meet in person if and when we can, and hopefully sooner rather than later, but also to pick up on the nuances, diversity, and any outstanding gaps or issues that are not covered in the actual webinar. It also gives us an opportunity to make sure that those especially Indigenous peoples who don't have the same connectivity and broadband width to engage in any of the webinars, an opportunity to attend the meeting, but also more significantly, an opportunity for state party members to appear in person and engage in the training webinar. As many may recall, the initial focus of the training workshop was to ensure that state party members of the convention are aware of the elements of Indigenous knowledge, the ethical engagement of Indigenous knowledge, and the diversity of Indigenous knowledge. So we felt that it was important to not only, because of the pandemic, to offer the training webinars and virtual sessions, but to still maintain the opportunity to attend in person, to dialogue about Indigenous knowledge through an in-person training workshop. I think that the concept note very well describes all of the intersections with the various different other activities. Yesterday, Jane spoke of the linkages with activities 3. There's also an important intersection with activities 5 and 6. As well as activity 1. And in this regard, I'll just conclude by indicating that it would be really useful to hear the suggestions and, more importantly, to receive the examples of guidelines and protocols, curriculum, any information that Indigenous peoples and their communities have developed. Yesterday, we heard in the context of the activity 3, the curriculum and materials, for example, from Estebancio and the long history of working on the issue of Indigenous knowledge back to 2010, I believe. All of that material and at least those pieces of information that Indigenous communities would like to share, if they can be transmitted to the Secretariat for purposes of inclusion as complementary materials to the training webinars, but also, of course, to be responsive to the request that Jane made yesterday as far as activity 3 is concerned, that that take place. The final matter is any suggestions that especially the Indigenous members of the Facilitative Working Group from the other 6 sociocultural regions to propose names of individuals that can be contributors to the series of the 4 webinars. And I won't go over the details of the dates and everything. The proposed schedule is placed in the concept note, but if those potential names of participants could be shared with myself and Joanna, Eli, and Tom, that would be great. But of course, include the Tiffany at the Secretariat. And so my final statement is many thanks to Tiffany for her assistance from the Secretariat in ushering this along. And if there's something that Eli would like to say or raise any gaps or underscore any items, as a courtesy, would like to invite him to do so. Thank you.
Elias, do you have any comments or additions?
Sure, and thank you, and thanks, Daly, for introducing the item. Maybe I'll just make 2 points. First, I also do want to thank Tom, Joanna, and Tiffany for all their work and their help on actually moving this forward. And the second point I would make is I would reiterate, I guess, one thing. This is all, of course, in the concept note, but just, you know, as a reminder, this first workshop or activity is really about building parties capacity to understand and ethically engage with Indigenous knowledge. And then at a later date, when we are developing additional capacity building activities, then those will be meant to help build the capacity of Indigenous peoples and local communities to engage. So this, just drawing out that distinction again, that in this, on this activity, we're really trying to help parties have that capacity to better engage with Indigenous knowledge. But I think overall, Daly highlighted everything very well. So forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. And I can stress from my point of view the urgency of this, just looking at different kinds of engagements and interactions that we've had, some of which we will discuss later in the meeting, regarding the clear distinction as two distinct constituencies, Indigenous peoples and local communities. I think that's very important, and I'm seeing that needs to continue to be stressed, and also the issue of the rights and sharing protocols and safeguards that we discussed yesterday. We, as a way to highlight this discussion as well. So with that, I'd like to ask if any of the members of the Facilitative Working Group would like to have comments or questions. Again, the concept note is posted, and it is considered already formally accepted and adopted by consensus. There was just an amendment to the delivery, I guess you could say, rather than a face-to-face into a virtual format. So it's not really a change in the intent or the plan. It's just the way the first discussions will take place. Estebancio.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Sorry, good morning from here. Good afternoon over there. Well, I would like to congratulate first Daly, Elia, and the rest who have been participating, including the Secretariat, on this issue. I have a question to Daly, and thank you, Daly, for your comments. And it's about the webinar. You asking that if we can put name forward for people who could participate or have experience on this issue, especially for our region, the Latin America is you won't find many people who speak English. So I wanted to know whether there is going to be a translation. And of course, it's difficult. I received so many messages yesterday asking me, how can they participate? I say, well, you have to register first, because they are watching in the other side and they cannot ask a question. So I would like to know more of this. Yes, I have a name. I can send to all of you who have been developing this, and I think that we can contribute as a CUNA on this a little bit. Of course, learn from you as well. But we really be happy to do that. But the person that I'm thinking right now is a Spanish speaker, but with a lot of knowledge, as you know, is one of your colleagues, Atencio Lopez. But I send you the message, the communication and all of this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question, Estebancio. And I think that it's also, I should say that in regard to the content and the materials to cover in the actual webinars, maybe a careful look at the four broad topics, and also consider linking those individuals to potential topic. But really, we are looking for people. I know that there are many knowledge holders, but people who have made this a subject of their activity within community and elsewhere. With regard to language and the challenge that we face with language across the board, I would just like to invite Tiffany to address that particular issue. I don't think that we should see language as a barrier in the context of the webinars, but if Tiffany from the Secretariat could address how that issue is going to be handled, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Daly. There will be interpretation in Spanish and French for the webinars. We've already organized that. The first webinar is scheduled for this month, 27th of October. So just a reminder that that one is quite a short timeline. Thank you.
Yes, and they are inviting the members to submit names of knowledge holders, and the topics are on the web page, so we can submit those to Daly and to Eli with a CC to the Secretariat just to make sure. Alec, and then you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, colleague, for that nice presentation. I was just wondering, my question is actually somehow related to what Estebancio asked. I'm just wondering whether the participation of Indigenous people in the webinars won't be limited by the access. So I don't know whether this question should be directed to Secretariat. Is there going to be support, for instance, for provision of bundles for those that won't have resources to buy bundles to participate in these webinars? Thank you.
That is a good question, but I don't know that it's within the purview of this particular activity, and is more a matter of broader infrastructure issues. And if I understand your question specifically, but infrastructure deficit for all intents and purposes, but potentially Tiffany at the Secretariat address that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Daly. Like you said, for participants, it's more difficult. These webinars, the first series is aimed at Indigenous peoples teaching, party representatives and others. So for the trainers who may be Indigenous elders, etc., we would definitely assist them with connectivity.
That's good to know. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yao?
Thank you very much. Particular thanks to Daly and Eli for your great work on this. First, I think I have a couple of possible speakers for the webinars that I'll send names for to both of you and CCs to the Secretariat from the SIDS. So hopefully we'll get that going. And my question has to do with local knowledge. There's already a question in the chat, and I think Daly, you referenced how the concept note addresses the issue of local knowledge and whether the workshops will address the webinars will address local knowledge. But if you could just maybe briefly comment on how the concept note addresses that for the benefit of the participants today. Thank you.
As noted in the concept note, and really building from the very initial meeting before even the composition of the platform, from an Indigenous people's perspective, there was concern expressed about the uncertainty of local communities, and that uncertainty remains in terms of local community representatives being present and active within this context, number one. Number two, the issue of Indigenous knowledge, as has been expressed in the resolution concerning this particular platform, and also elsewhere within the United Nations and other intergovernmental organization fora, the discrete area of Indigenous peoples, their status, their role, and their rights, as well as their knowledge, has been fairly clearly defined both in scholarship and otherwise. And for purposes of this particular training, workshop, series of webinars, and in-person meetings, the emphasis and the focus, as described in the concept note, is on Indigenous knowledge explicitly. With regard to local communities, and local knowledge, there is potential, and the concept note doesn't exclude it, but there is potential that once those local community representatives provide clarity with regard to the subject matter and the content of local knowledge, then the issue happens to be in their hands and will be responsive to that as a whole in terms of the facilitative working group. For the moment, as far as Indigenous knowledge and the content of this series of webinars, and I guess that's what I was referring to without saying it specifically, is that it will emphasize the content and the subject matter of Indigenous people's knowledge and the opportunity to illuminate that particular issue for purposes of the state party representatives to understand the content, the sensitivity to Indigenous knowledge, as well as more significantly, the ethical engagement of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge holders for purposes of co-production of knowledge about the impacts of climate change to their homelands, their biodiversity, etc. So that might be a long-winded way of answering your specific question, but that's the way that we have been in dialogue about the topic itself and this particular activity.
Thank you for clarifying that, Daly. That was a question. And in the chat room, there is a lot of chat coming across. So I thank Yao for flagging that question, which I also saw. If people could indicate if they're asking a question somehow, because there's a lot of good morning, I'm so-and-so. There's technical questions about interpretation, and it will just help us as co-chairs if you can maybe at the beginning of your statement in the chat put question for the speakers or something so that we can flag those easier. That was the main question that I saw too, is the issue of the inclusion of I guess local communities knowledge. And I think Daly already responded very well to that. Are there any more questions or comments from the members? And then we can go on. And Tiffany, you're helping me also, because people are raising their hands in the participants list. They're also putting questions in the chat. So Tiffany, go ahead, please. Unmute. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. I can respond to one of the questions about how people can register. So we'll put the registration information on the webpage for this, and we'll disseminate it widely through our networks, our LCIPP Friends Network, and all the registered participants for this meeting. For this meeting, the registration was a bit more formal. We use notifications, etc. But for the webinars, we'll put how to register on the webpage, and all you'd need to do is go to the webpage and register through there. Anyone can register.
Thank you very much. There's also, I noticed questions about the translation that maybe you could respond to through the chat if people have questions about interpretation for this meeting. The Secretariat will clarify that on the chat because I see a lot of comments about that.
WeSum has responded on that. If people have a look, ladies and gentlemen, have a look in the chat, and WeSum has responded on how to access the interpretation.
Fantastic. We're almost towards the end of this session. I think a lot of information about how to participate, how to engage for the members, how to submit possible speakers or participants, and we'll all eagerly await the announcements on how to listen in. I have one hand raised. I think, did it go down? One hand raised from the participants. I think, Gustavo, your question was answered. So I think the hand is down. I don't see any more hands or questions.
I'm raising my hand, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Hindu, and I see one question that came in, and I thank you for prefacing it with the word question. So, okay, Hindu, and then one more question, and then we need to close this topic. Thank you, Hindu.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And sorry to come late for the discussions. My question is it any like quota for representation by region or how it's work? My concern is like from my region, even if you see from this meeting or the last virtual meeting, you have like very, very few from Africa. And the reason is because there is very poor access to the internet, and internet is also paying. People don't want to put the money in order to invest to something more important for them to come to the webinar. Of course, it's important, but they do not see the direct link to them live. And I don't want to have like entire region getting excluded for this training. And so this is my first questions. I don't know really how it can work, but otherwise it will be unequal and then not inclusive. And I will feel really like not good for my entire region to do not be representative there. And my second question is, it is about the knowledge, and the knowledge holders are from the community level, rural areas. I know that from my own communities and many others. So I don't know how they will get through the webinar, even if they get some support to be there and then to discuss. And then most of them, they do not even speak the national languages. So there are like a lot of limit on need. I don't know if you think about how we can deal with these kind of challenges. Thank you. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you. I don't know if Daly wanted to respond. I think Tiffany had responded to some of the questions about, at least for the presenters, connectivity support. But Daly, did you want to respond?
Thanks, Hindu, for the very first question about representation from the 7 sociocultural regions. We have made some initial efforts because, as said, the October 27 for the first training webinar is fast approaching, and we need to begin the production of that particular webinar. So in terms of names of individuals, we want to try to integrate and at least represent a good balance of representation from the 7 sociocultural regions. So if suggestions can be brought forward, including some of the information about, of course, how to reach the individual, but also their background and work, that would be immensely helpful. We don't actually have a quota per se in terms of individuals that the various different regions can propose. It is a significant challenge as far as identification of individuals to share perspectives within this series of 4 webinars. We have identified at least some individuals based upon certainly my past experience as a former member of the Permanent Forum and former member of the Voluntary Fund, and knowing Indigenous peoples from across various different regions and within the subject matter area of Indigenous knowledge. But we welcome the suggestions, but there isn't a quota. If we have a good balance, then we're moving in the right direction. As to your other questions about infrastructure and access and language, I think those remain outstanding challenges, not only for this activity, but every activity of this particular facilitative working group. Even right now, the number of participants able to access the meeting, we have 91, and that includes all of us as well. So it's a major challenge, I think, across the board for everybody, and how to overcome the access and the language issue is huge. So I expect that, of course, the Secretariat will do whatever they can within their means to ensure access. But the comment by Tiffany about those individuals for purposes of the actual webinars and the recording of the individuals who will present and contribute as trainers, that support will be there and in hand. But the larger questions about access for those out there and on the ground that do have challenges with broadband width and the cost. And I have to say that for many of our communities across the whole of the Arctic, just imagine in your mind somebody out there in the frozen tundra trying to tie two wires together. So, you know, it's still a major challenge, and I don't know, possibly Tiffany has something further to add to that issue, but I think it's a challenge that's going to face all of us, especially throughout the pandemic. And that's why it's important that we tried to preserve at least this one day in-person activity if we are all able to come together in a full FWG-wide meeting, as well as substat to ensure that government representatives and Indigenous peoples who don't otherwise have access, and if we're able to travel, to do so in person.
Okay. Thank you very much. We are truly out of time for this agenda item in order to have time for the other activities. I have questions about registration. I think Tiffany took care of that we will all receive the flyers or the notices and get them out to our regions, as well as post on the listserv, the webpage. And I think, Joseph, did you have your hand up to speak on this item? Tiffany flagged me that you want to say something. No, okay. Well, it's just as well, because as I said, we are out of time. I think we all want to express our thanks to the co-leads on this very important activity, and also for their flexibility and trying to make adjustments to the current reality while we preserve the space like we are for the regional gatherings for when we can meet in time. The next topic is Activity 5, Outreach, Dissemination Plan, and Thematic Training Materials. And of course, that's closely aligned with the training workshops in terms of the materials being made available to all constituencies, Indigenous peoples, state parties, agencies, etc. The co-lead for this activity is Joseph and Jane, and the concept note is online. It has already been approved by consensus, so we're just going to have a very brief, please, update on any progress that's been made or anything that the members need to know about. I have here in my notes that Jane will share her screen for a slideshow with proposed themes. Is that the case, Jane?
Yes, I will. I'm going to just briefly state some of the primary objectives with this concept note, and then I'm going to share some progress on behalf of myself and the other co-lead for this activity, which was Joseph Skultety from the Slovakia Ministry of Environment. So the Outreach and Dissemination Plan's primary objective is to familiarize Indigenous peoples, local communities, parties, and other relevant stakeholders with action items within the LCIPP work plan, as well as to mobilize the promotion and participation of our action items. And the primary objective of the thematic training materials is to orient parties and other relevant stakeholders to the unique worldviews and perspectives with which Indigenous peoples and local communities approach conservation in general and climate change specifically. Some of these training materials will be developed in connection to Activities 4's thematic training workshops, and others will be shared by theme as supplemental training materials. And as part of our concept note, Joseph and I have started to draft with the Secretariat some ideas for these supplemental thematic training materials. And so I'm going to share my screen. There. So this is our working list of proposed lists of themes for training materials. These will be shared primarily through the web portal, but we will also be disseminating this information in a variety of other ways. We have options for paper materials that can be sent out, promotional emails, social media, and website dissemination as well. But this is still up for review. This is kind of where we're at currently in terms of making progress on the materials. And so we have traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples, and local knowledge, which includes the ethical and equitable engagement thereof, which is very much in line with what we just discussed for activity 4. Biodiversity and ecosystems, Indigenous food systems, participation and engagement in climate change processes, funding opportunities for Indigenous peoples related to climate change, Indigenous governance and management structures, Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies, and then participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in national climate procedures. And so if anybody has more to add to this or comments on this, we definitely want input from members, observers, everybody who's participating in this. And we see this just as a good way to, in addition to, our training webinars, there's already been some discussion of accessibility and how many will be able to attend this. Hopefully for those who are not able, these supplemental training materials will be of some assistance, since they will, just be able to be disseminated through online and hopefully paper materials as well for those who don't have regular access to email and the internet. Joseph, if you have anything to add, please feel free. And
can I add?
Joseph.
Hello.
Hello, Joseph is going to take the floor next as the co-lead. And
Can
then
I speak?
Kirit.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, but Joseph, did you want to make a comment first? I'm going to give the floor to you as the co-lead, as Jane requested, if you want to add, and then Kirit.
Thank you. Just a few words. We really tried to cover all area of needed themes we identified, and we discussed also within our network of contacts and people we are working them with. And I guess that this list is quite exhaustive. Nevertheless, we are open to the ideas how to modify it if necessary, or what to complete, because we see that the necessity for covering the required knowledge enrichment and dissemination is really important. That's all from my side for now. Thank you very much, Jane, for presenting our activities within this activity 5.
Thank you very much. I have another hand on the screen, Kirit Shalat. If you could identify your role, position, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I am Dr. Kirit Shalat. The organization's name is National Council for Sustainable Development and Public Leadership. It's based in India, Gujarat. My observation or question is, are we looking Indigenous people as museum? We want them to remain in same position, or we want to mainstream them? We want to make them pilots, doctors, lawyers, or we just want them to follow what they are doing? We can have a strategy to preserve their tradition, their culture, their systems, and learn from that. But what is our strategy to bring them on par with us? And I will take 1 minute or 2 minutes to explain how we are doing it in India. In India, any indigenous people, we call them tribals, the people who have been original inhabitants of an area. And they have education free in any college, or for graduation, post-graduation, and even for becoming pilot. And their accommodation is also free. They are given full scholarship. And the systematic training takes place to promote them to compete with rest of the society. And therefore, we had even in a state of Gujarat, from where we are working, the chief minister of state was a tribal person. So indigenous people should be also on par in public governance system with the rest of the us. That is my submission. So although this program is good, my submission will be to strengthen them and bring them on par with rest of us. Thank you for giving this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we're also getting some additional comments from the floor about, for instance, water being included as one of the themes. And I'm sure the Secretariat will provide us all with all the suggestions in the chat if we don't have time to hear from everybody. I have a question for the co-leads. And is your intent mainly to collect existing materials that then we can integrate into, make available through the web page and the trainings? Or are you looking to actually develop new training materials primarily? Because I think a lot of these kinds of documents maybe exist out there, you know, in our collective world. But I'm just asking, is how do you see the opportunity for people to present what's already been developed?
I think for me, at least, I think that, you know, looking at this list, there are probably a lot of examples of such training materials that already exist within our own regions. And so I think, you know, sharing those widely with the Secretariat and to us so that we can share those and make use of those that are already in existence will be important. And perhaps where we don't find examples of existing training materials, we can come together as members to co-create those. In our concept note, we also note that these training materials, we can decide as a group whether we want to strategically write them for specific parties. You know, if we're trying to engage a specific stakeholder, we might want to tier the training materials to them, or we may keep them general so that they can just be learning materials for a wide variety of groups and people.
Thank you very much. If it's acceptable to the group and nobody has another comment on this, we can move on with very profound thanks to the co-leads for your work on this area. Oh, okay, Hindu, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Thank you so much for this initial work. My comment is, when I see the list, it looks like all what we wanted to give to the government, like the training that they need in all those thematics. And then I think from the objective, it is both way, the capacity for indigenous peoples and local communities to enable our engagement into the process of the UNFCCC, and also the capacity of the parties to the other stakeholder to understand how to work with us. So I think the part of how our capacity also can be maintained or emphasized is a little bit missing in this list we have. So maybe I can advise you to include by what we need as indigenous peoples, and not just like funding opportunity. That's fine, like it's a general. So what we need. So maybe you can discuss with the IP caucus in general, and then all of us can include the different regions can be included. And maybe from Joseph from the Paris, he can also discuss with similarly with the group of the Paris to see what they have to offer to the indigenous peoples, and the list can complete this one in order to have the response of both of needed of capacity building that we express. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hindu. I have one more request for the floor. I will just also note the importance of the co-leads to look when you get the chat, because there are several good suggestions. For example, Indigenous environmental and human rights defenders, which is a big theme, you know, in the Human Rights Council and other areas. Role of customary institutions for climate mitigation and adaptation. There's some good suggestions coming across. I'm just saying that may want to be, I mentioned water, as one other area. So look at the chat and see how those can be also integrated as we move forward. And especially if those suggesting those training materials have training materials in those topics that you've developed in your organization, your nation, your people, your region, this would be also a good opportunity to submit those, and we could ask the leads to find a way to maybe you make a section on the portal for training materials from different regions and international bodies. I have one more. Oh, from FAO has some training materials already too. They say they would like to submit. Jan Fernandez. I have one request for the floor, and that will be the last time for this agenda item. Ricardo Perez. Oh, was there somebody else that want to make it?
Eli here.
Oh, Eli. Okay, sorry.
I can't find my hand.
Okay, Eli, that's all right. Eli, and then Pasang, and then we'll go to the floor. Thank you. Eli, then Pasang.
Oh, okay, sure. I'll go. Thank you. And thanks, Jane and Joseph, for presenting this. I think there's a lot of good ideas here, and I think my only comment is that we just need to be mindful of capacity to produce all of that, because I think we're and people are giving us additional good ideas on what kind of training materials we can add to the list. And I'm just mindful of, you know, we may need to prioritize or do something, because I don't think we'll be able to necessarily get at everything, but maybe I'm wrong on that point. Also, I was wondering, what was the timeline related to this activity, as that may also impact the feasibility of the number of training materials that we could actually advance here.
Yeah, I'm just checking the timeline now. So by the end of this year, we are hoping to have the ODP, the Outreach Dissemination Plan, and accompanying templates and guides published on the web portal, and some thematic training materials published. So we are trying to get this going sooner than later. So it will be a very quick push to get these materials collected. And I would just like to ask Tiffany or somebody from the Secretariat to help us in keeping track of the chat and all the suggestions that are coming in.
Yeah, thanks. We'll do that, Jane. We're keeping note of all of the suggestions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yo, did you have a comment? Tiffany's telling me your hand was raised. I'm trying to look at these three ways things are coming in. So if I miss you, please let me know. Yo, did you have a comment on this?
I did. I took it down because you were running out of time. I can withdraw the comment, or I can say it very briefly. Well, this is actually a little bit of a response to Hindu, because I think she was talking about the other objective for this activity, which is to enable the engagement of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the UNFCCC process. My understanding is that that's the purpose of the ODP, the Outreach Dissemination Plan. That's for that particular prong of the objectives, and then the thematic materials will be targeted mostly to the parties. That's my understanding. Thank you.
Yes, and that's why I raised the issue of compiling existing materials, because it sounds like there are a lot, and that will be much more feasible in the time frame than actually trying to draft whole new curricula, especially since a lot does exist. Pasang, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. Good evening, everyone. Maybe good afternoon for many of you. good morning for some of you. So regarding this one, thank you, Delhi and Jane, for working hard on this one. I just would like to respond the gentleman from India, the queries, because this is very important that we need to be very clear what we are doing and how we are moving and what is our stand and what we are trying to achieve. So this is very important, especially the activity 5 and along with the other activities, actually to fulfill the three function of the platform. The knowledge, especially the indigenous knowledge that has been undermined for many years and for generation since the establishment of the the 1992 Rio Conventions started. So what I understand personally that throughout the history, almost for more than 2 decades, especially after the establishment of the platform in 2015. So one of the part is acknowledgement of the indigenous knowledge, because the different study, different even including the intergovernment panel on climate change, and even different bilateral, multilateral, and even the intergovernmental reports come up with the fact that indigenous knowledge and indigenous experience in fact contributing for climate change adaptation and mitigation. So undervaluing the putting their knowledge and values under shadow is not fair to them, because they have in fact contributing for climate change resilience. So understanding and promoting the knowledge, that doesn't mean that they will be put in the museum, or they will be just maintaining just what it is. But the most important is how we balance it. We cannot ignore science, we cannot ignore the modern education, we cannot be away from the Western influence or modern influence or capitalistic world. But the most important for indigenous people is how we balance with indigenous knowledge, so that the future generation will not be just not be brought up in a way that we undervalue our own value system, the wealth of knowledge, in fact, that has been contributing for climate change resilience. And the world is suffering because science already come up with the fact that science knowledge is not enough to deal with the climate crisis. So that is one of even after almost 2 decades of the negotiation, finally they come up with the fact that indigenous knowledge is very important. So that is why even activity 5 and even other activities trying to highlight that the indigenous values and knowledge is very important, and it need to be understood very closely, and our capacity need to be built on that, how the indigenous knowledge has been contributing, and especially in the customary governance system, the role of the customary institution, role of their own management system, and the values and the cultural and spiritual values, how they're interconnected with the climate change resilience contribution through the management of the natural resources. So I hope I'm clear with that, but I would be happy to discuss further on this one, that for indigenous people is not just only just only like the way what you think. And then the initiatives what you have mentioned in India is very good, and that was very positive efforts from the government. However, it is very important that they do not lose their values, that they do not lose their connectivity to their roots, because that is where the dignity and the respect comes from. I'll stop now, Andrea, but if needed, I will be happy to explain.
Thank you. And we can also respond to the comments and questions in the chat. I will now call on the last speaker, but I do want to highlight an important point that came out, I think, addressing that last one on the screen, that many Indigenous peoples are not talking about adaptation and mitigation. They're still talking about combating climate change. I know that's certainly the case in my region, is fighting against the causes and not to let that go, while we talk about adaptation and resiliency. So just want to highlight that again. All this is in the chat. So the last person to speak, I lost his name, Ricardo. Do you have his name, Ricardo? Ricardo
Yes.
Perez. Okay, okay, sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And just one proposal, maybe a topic which can summarize what are the dimensions to indigenous people's rights and knowledge in the Paris Agreement and other climate processes. I think this might be important. And another topic that it would be important is that maybe what are the status of the negotiations for indigenous peoples. What are they proposing to the Paris Agreement and other decisions? What are they proposing in regard to Article 6, in regard to ecosystem integrity? You know, maybe just summarize that, so we it will be, I think, important for the training materials. Thank you.
Thank you. I do believe we're going to talk a little bit about Article 6 later in the meeting, not today. So with that, I will close this agenda item. Clearly,
Can I take one?
no, I'm sorry, no. You're going to have to do that in the chat. And because we have another activity to speak to, and I was just going to say, clearly all of this is needing more in-depth discussion, and maybe there could be ongoing listservs or discussion groups set up by the Secretariat for additional comments and dialogue. I'm sorry, very sorry, but we don't have more time on this activity because we have one more before the break, and I don't want to cut them short either. This is activity 6, and this is one that has that is still under development and has not been adopted, you could say, by consensus in terms of the concept note. So this is participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in climate change related bodies and processes. And the lead for this is myself. It has me here, even though I did minimal work compared to Eli, Hindu, Irina, and Yo. We had a good group working on this. So my notes say that Eli will give the current status of the discussion. And I turn the floor over to you, Eli. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thanks to obviously all the other co-chairs on this item, but also to Tiffany and the Secretariat, who did actually help us quite a bit to advance this. So I'll briefly just remind people what this activity is about. So the objective really is to develop a set of recommendations on the engagement and input of Indigenous peoples and local communities across the UNFCCC process. So that's our main task, is to come up with these recommendations. But in addition to the recommendations, the activity itself also mandates us to produce an accompanying guiding document or toolkit, if you will. So that essentially will complement and expand on the recommendations. We'll make recommendations on how to engage, and then we'll develop a toolkit that will sort of help us basically in that regard. There's two activities that are very much linked to this that we're going to base these recommendations on. So you'll recall we have activity 7 and activity 9. Activity 7 looks at the good practices for the engagement of local communities and Indigenous peoples across basically all the climate related bodies inside and outside the convention. And activity 9 looks at how local communities and Indigenous peoples, how they are engaging in existing policies, actions under the convention as well. So 7 is good practices for engaging with local communities and Indigenous peoples under and outside the convention. Activity 9 looks at how I know they kind of seem similar, but activity 9 is how local communities and Indigenous peoples are engaging in existing policies and action under the convention, with the view to obviously look at addressing the gaps. So we will take those two activities, the findings of these activities, we will use them to help us craft the recommendations for activity 6. But also we are now considering, so that we're not just relying on activity 7 or activity 9, we are considering a sort of a standalone half-day virtual dialogue to solicit direct input from, well, basically from everyone on this call right now, from local communities and Indigenous peoples on the possible recommendations. So we're still in that phase of developing this activity. I think that's where we are, and but happy to turn it over to some of the other co-leads if I missed something. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm just reminding the participants that are not members of the FWG that this particular draft is not yet posted on the website, along just the concept notes and plans that have been already agreed by consensus of the members are posted. And this one is still under discussion. I think we have 3 that are in that category. So thank you very much. And I will just say, as a co-lead, my question that maybe you've had a chance to talk about, based on recent dialogues that the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for the Sustainable Development Goals set up globally and also regionally, that looked at the convergence between work with the SDGs, the Convention on Biodiversity, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. One thing that was raised was is there an opportunity to make recommendations when there's gaps to facilitate Indigenous people's participation, maybe gaps that existed before the establishment of this body that now we can address. And one that I raised to you was the issue of the Green Climate Fund, for example, where an Indigenous representative sits on that advisory group, but not as Indigenous people's representative. They're included in civil society. And we don't have a distinct role as Indigenous peoples in terms of being considered for funding, direct funding, for example, under the Green Climate Fund. And that was just one example that came to mind. And I would just suggest that we also leave that opportunity open for one of our outcomes is recommending where there are gaps. There's not an opportunity, not just how we're participating in existing opportunities, but maybe where opportunities are lacking or need to be expanded or need to be formalized. So that would just be one suggestion I could make to our working group collectively. Are there any comments on this from the members of the working group? Think about it. Good. I'm sure there must be other comments. So if, okay, yeah, good. Yo, thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrea. And thanks in particular to Eli for presenting on this activity. Just on your question, Andrea, I think the concept note for this, the draft concept note for this activity contemplates reviewing the technical paper that'll be produced under activity 9. And that technical paper will address the issue of gaps. So that can be tapped if we are to make recommendations with regards to gaps under this activity 6. Thanks.
Thank you. And maybe I can ask Ellen Mariano, who sits on that Green Climate Fund, to draft a paragraph or what her recommendations are in that regard. Thank you. Eli.
Yeah, thanks.
Can I speak?
No, right now we're just hearing from members of the working group, Kirit.
Thanks, Sandra. I did want to recall that the set of recommendations we are to produce under Activity 6 pertain to the UNFCCC process itself. So this is where I think that the GCF might fall outside the scope. But I'm looking at activity 9, whether it would be addressed there under the convention. yeah, again, see, activity 9 is engagement under the convention and look to make recommendations and address gaps. So we'll have to be mindful of scope here. I think the scope issue probably comes up in a lot of activities because we actually want to make them as comprehensive as possible, but at the same time, we're trying to make sure we sort of remain in some sort of feasible work plans. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that. Thanks.
Hindu.
Thanks, Andrea. Merci, Elias, for the great presentations. I think that's also the reason, I think, from the activity 9 that I will present later, and then the activity 4. So we will take all the recommendation, and regarding to the access to the funding, as you are asking, Andrea, maybe it cannot be directed to GCF because it's under, but we will use the activity 4 who is tackling also outside to make the linkages and take this important item of how the other external body can also figure out into the recommendation. So I think it is the way of how we can see the things and how we can include it. And as we are so many coaches there, I think we will come up with an idea to put it in. I think it's really very important to have it. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other comments from Facilitative Working Group members? We went over a little bit last time. And so according to my clock, we have 3 minutes left for this activity. If there's no comments from members of the working group, I can open it up to the floor. I think Kirit had a brief comment. Is that the case? Kirit? Yes, just to comment. I was using.
Yeah, sir. Thank you. What I am trying to suggest is slightly different. See, indigenous communities and the regions where they stay have developed stress-resistant crops, tree species, grasses. And we are learning from them. For example, what we call orphan crops are highly nutritious, and today we are promoting them. So can you add this to your list, that what adaptation we can do from what they are doing and replicate in other areas?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your comment. And I think it was in the chat where I was stressing, Yao and Yo also, that the Green Climate Fund was one example. There may be other gaps in constituted bodies, for example, within the UNFCCC, where we might make a recommendation that Indigenous peoples would have a more formal role or a more clear voice. So that was just one example, and I understand it's slightly outside, but there, if somebody is analyzing those gaps that may enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples in the existing bodies of the UNFCCC, that would be, I think, good to have one of the activity areas be able to address that as part of their recommendations. So thank you very much for taking that into account. We have come to the end of the morning session. the first part of the morning session for me. It's 8:20 in the morning where I am. So I think that we have scheduled, is this correct, Tiffany, a 20-minute break at this point? And then we will change to Yo as the co-chair who will facilitate the next items on the agenda till the end of the agenda. So thank you everybody for your participation, cooperation, mutual respect. And with that, I turn it to the Secretariat for any housekeeping issues.
Thanks, Andrea. At this point, we don't have any housekeeping announcements.
Okay, well, thank you. It's been a very rich discussion. I think some of the issues we could have gone more in depth on, but I really appreciate all the comments, and the information in the chat also is very rich. So I look forward to making sure we all receive those recommendations from the general participants in this meeting, who are UN agencies, other UN agencies, as well as Indigenous peoples and some local communities as well, who are giving their input into this dialogue. So with that, I welcome you all to get some coffee or whatever's appropriate for your time of day. And we'll rejoin the meeting at 8:40. Is that correct? Or in 20 minutes, I should say. For me, 8:40 in the morning, 20 minutes from now. Please, everybody, come back, and we'll go on with the next pieces of the agenda to discuss more of the activities and the work that's been done so far. Thank you so much again.
Hello, everyone. Just a quick announcement. If FWG members can put on their videos, if they can, and other participants can please keep their videos off just to help the chair to see when her other members are waving at her for the floor. That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much to Andrea for leading our discussion earlier today in the first half of today's meeting. And for this second half, I will try to facilitate our discussions, focusing on activities 7 and 9 of the work plan. And so we will begin with activity 7. Activity 7, the co-leads are actually Eli and myself. I will give the update on this particular activity with a little bit of an assist from the Secretariat later on. The concept note for activity 7, I think it's been posted. The link for it has been posted in the chat, as well as a background note for information. And it's also online, they're also online. Just a brief explanation of the objective of activity 7. The main objective of activity 7 is to conduct a survey, sort of a mapping exercise of existing mandates, policies, and practices pertaining to the participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in climate change related bodies and processes, both under as well as outside the convention. The methodology for this particular activity that's reflected in the concept note, multiple elements. One, we would work with different interested entities, as well as secretariats of relevant multilateral instruments and processes, as well as representatives of Indigenous peoples organizations to provide feedback for this survey, for this mapping exercise. There was also a call for submissions that was launched on the UNFCCC submissions portal earlier this year. And a good number of submissions were uploaded to the portal in response to this particular call. Submissions from parties as well as non-parties. We also anticipate incorporating feedback from activity 10 into the output for this particular activity 7. Yes, and so that is the particular methodology for this activity. In terms of potential deliverables or outputs, we anticipate putting together a technical paper that'll capture the submissions received, as well as the discussion that we'll hopefully have in this meeting of the FWG. That technical paper will be posted online in due course, and hopefully it'll be considered by the FWG in our next FWG meeting, FWG 4, for finalization. So that's just a basic overview of this activity 7. And actually, Eli already referenced activity 7 in our previous discussion as a possible input into activity 6. So there's that other linkage for this activity as well. Before I turn it over to the Secretariat, I don't know if Eli would like to add anything to this brief recap. Are you good? Thanks. In that case, I would like to turn over the floor to a member of the Secretariat to give a brief presentation on examples of submissions that have been received in response to the call for submissions for this particular activity. I don't think I need to do anything, yes? Or do I need to actually give anyone any sort of privilege. Please advise Secretariat.
No, Yo, that's fine. We'll take over. Avi will do the presentation and he's going to share his screen.
Great, thanks.
Greetings to one and all present here. I will quickly walk you through the bodies and processes that were mentioned in the submissions we received under Activity 7 of the work plan. So we received a total of 11 submissions. Here are the bodies and the processes that were mentioned under the UNFCCC. And here we have the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform and its Facilitative Working Group, along with a list of other bodies and processes which are listed in alphabetical order. Amongst the ones that were listed most frequently were the LCIPP and its FWG, the Paris Agreement, the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, and the WIM EXCOM. Here are some bodies from outside the UNFCCC, outside the convention, but still within the UN system. And here we received a total of 26 different responses. Here, the ones that were mentioned most commonly were the CBD and its working group 8J, the IPCC, the Human Rights Council, and the IPBES. We also have the following bodies and processes from outside the UN, which included global bodies like the IUCN, as well as regional bodies like the Arctic and Nordic Councils. And finally, we had bodies that are part of the financial mechanism of the convention, which were mentioned, and these were the Adaptation Fund and the Indigenous Peoples Policy of the Green Climate Fund. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Avi. And that's basically it in terms of an update on this particular activity from the co-leads and from the Secretariat. And I would like to open up the floor for discussion on this activity. We've had a bit of discussion already about possible linkages between different activities that we've discussed so far, as well as activities that we will discuss. So perhaps you might take that into consideration as you provide feedback. As well as provide any feedback on the examples listed in the Secretariat slides. But I open the floor to the FWG members in particular. I see Andrea, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I know we're planning to discuss in a little bit, maybe in a day or two, collaborative work with the CBD. Especially relating to resiliency and adaptation of biodiversity, seeds, etc. And very much overlap with some of the work we're doing. And I would also say that in past meetings, we've raised the idea, and in fact, we did so in Mexico last September, in preparation for the UN Climate Summit, had a collaborative event with the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, along with the Facilitative Working Group. So the working group for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So those are just two that I think that we have done past work with and are planning upcoming work with as well to include. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Would any other FWG member like to take the floor? And yes, if you do have other examples of practices or policies or activities under in climate change related bodies or processes, both under or outside the convention, please feel free to highlight them here in this discussion so we can add them to the survey process. I do not see, oh yes, Hindu, I see you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this activity. There are a lot of policies, of course, and then we need to focus on the climate change. I'm thinking about the SDGs because the SDG 13 is already climate change, and then when you go also to the land or to the oceans, there are many SDGs that related to those to the indigenous peoples and climate change policies. So it will be good to include them maybe in the survey. And there is also the development banks, because when we talk about the policies we include or exclude, we have Inter-American Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, and African Development Bank, not really in the way that they have policies and they do not have policies. And the important thing will be next month in November, there will be a big conference for all the development banks who will be focused on biodiversity and climate change. So if they, those who have the policies, they will maybe review it or maybe not. And those who do not have, we are working to see how they can include it. So it will be also good to add that one in the list. Yeah, and then for the rest, maybe we can discuss also internally when you advance a little bit into the document and see if there is a gap to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hindu, and very much well noted. The floor is still open to the FWG members if you have any additional comments. I do not see.
Just one thing. They are also African Union commissions, and then that you can pass through the climate focal points. So it will be also very helpful to look at all those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hindu. I see you, Andrea. Please go ahead.
Thank you for letting me take the floor again. I just wanted to mention in regards to the UN Human Rights Council, which you did have on your list, there's work progressing now that I've been part of through my organization, and CL also that has worked with us for the implementation of a UN Special Rapporteur on climate change. And this has also, had the collaboration and support of the rapporteur on right to environment, as well as the UN rapporteur on rights of indigenous peoples. So I just want to flag that for you. There is ongoing discussion about proposing the creation of that special rapporteur, which will obviously be under the umbrella of the Human Rights Council, a mandate that we probably want to engage with. It's not, established yet, of course, but, right now there's no human rights mandate holder responsible for ensuring the implementation of what is in the Paris Agreement preamble, which is that, the state commitment to take rights of indigenous peoples and human rights overall into account with the implementation of responses and programs relating to climate change. So this would be something that is of interest there, and I think many indigenous peoples organizations have already signed on to that effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And yes, this work, at least from a SIDS perspective, there are a couple of members of the Human Rights Council now that are SIDS, and they're very interested in this particular element of the council taking a more focused look at climate change. So that's very well noted. Thank you. I see Daly. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Yao, for the introduction of this particular activity. To some extent, there's a really subjective nature to this, right? Especially when we talk about the notion of good practices and who decides what good practices are. The chair of the Circumpolar Inuit Health Steering Committee actually has moved away from the use of that term and references wise practices. So, but it still has a subjective nature. And I wonder if there has been consideration of who decides what practices are good or not. And especially if you think about it from the perspective of Indigenous peoples.
Yes, thank you very much, Daly. At least at this point, between Eli and myself, we are just basically in a reception mode, receiving different inputs and submissions. But this particular point on how to characterize these particular kinds of practices, I think this is something that can be addressed in the technical paper, the draft technical paper that will hopefully be produced in the next, between now and the next facilitative working group meeting. And then that can definitely be part of the discussion going forward, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I just want to bolster the idea that rather than those working within UN agencies and elsewhere in terms of the existing policies and all the work that has been done under the umbrella of good practices, from an Indigenous perspective, sometimes they might not be, right? So we have to remember to include that. And as far as the technical paper, I guess we can have an opportunity in future to look at that particular dynamic of this activity. Thank you, Yao.
Thank you very much, Daly. And I think that's very, very well noted. And also, just a reminder that activity 7 is envisioned to contribute as a possible input to activity 6, which talks about engagement and input across the CCC process. So hopefully that can feed in there as well.
Right. Thank you.
Are there any other FWG members who would like to take the floor? I do not see anyone raising or waving at me. If there are no more comments from the members, I'd like to open up the floor to the rest of the participants, to the wider roster of participants, if there are any comments from the floor. I'm just looking through the chat and I do not see any questions posted in the chat. But please, if you have any comments, please raise your hand. I'll give you about a minute. Let's see. Actually, I'll give you about 15 seconds. I do not see anybody raising. Unfortunately, my Spanish is very poor, but I think this person is asking for the floor. Felipe? Yes, I think that you're asking for the floor. And I might ask one of my fellow members to translate for me because my English translation is not working. But please, Felipe, if you're speaking in Spanish, I might need translation, but please go ahead.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. I'm going to speak in Spanish because a lot of my friends and sisters, brothers here in Latin America want to do that from my side. So sorry about that, but I'm going to speak in Spanish. I hope everybody has your translation system okay. Bueno, desde la presidencia, buenos días a todos. Hemos creado a partir de la presidencia COP25 una instancia que creo que puede aportar en este ámbito en el que están revisando. Particularmente hemos creado una plataforma web a través de la cual estamos buscando iniciar una recopilación de buenas prácticas de comunidades locales y pueblos indígenas. Lo que buscamos es poder visibilizar esas buenas prácticas para potenciar la acción climática en Chile, poniendo por delante el ejemplo que las comunidades indígenas y comunidades locales nos pueden otorgar con tan valioso conocimiento y con tanta experiencia, ¿no es cierto?, y cercanía con la naturaleza que muchos no tenemos. Y luego estamos enfocados en que esa recopilación de buenas prácticas, hecho voluntariamente por hermanas y hermanos indígenas que ya están empezando a participar, pueda transformarse también en una instancia de apoyo y fomento económico hacia ellos, dado que muchas de estas actividades tienen un componente de economía local que vemos que podemos aportar en una primera instancia desde el desarrollo de una guía rutera de buenas prácticas para que no solamente desde Chile, sino que aquellos que visiten nuestro país puedan conocer esas buenas prácticas viajando con esta guía rutera de buenas prácticas en cambio climático. Y con mucho gusto estamos disponibles para poner a disposición el trabajo que estamos llevando y esperamos que este pueda ser un aporte en el sentido de esta actividad número 7. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And actually, my translation worked this time, so I was able to pick up on the translation. So thank you very much. And yes, we welcome collaboration from your organization on this going forward, including the work you've been doing in collecting information. Yes. So looking through. Oh, sorry. Okay, I don't see it. Okay. So just looking through the chat, I believe I have a request from the floor from FAO. Ion from FAO. If you can take the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I wanted to comment on the point that Dale Sambo made. I think it's extremely important. I think all of us that we are here, Dale, our objective is to identify wise practices or good practices, always from Indigenous people's point of view. So I think it's important for Indigenous peoples to identify what are the good practices or the wise practices for you. Not only in the UN, what the UN is doing that is correct for you so that we can amplify that. But also I think very important is what are the wise practices for Indigenous peoples in relation to some of the agenda items that are being discussed at the global level. On energy, on water management, on climate resilience, on the Indigenous food systems. I think that's where it is extremely important to have Indigenous peoples identified what are the wise practices or good practices and what they are not. In the end, the big challenge that we all have together, Dale and colleagues, is to come up with a new narrative, a new terminology, and new metrics to measure things that moves us away from the quantity, from yield, and that moves us towards more respect of nature, the integration of cosmogony in everything that we do, and more respectful ways of dealing with human beings and with nature. And for that, we need a new architecture. The one that is existing is very inexact. So any wise practice, any wise terminology certainly should come from Indigenous peoples, and there is probably a unique opportunity for Indigenous peoples to speak very loud and clear on this. And I think a lot of the UN agencies and the world are going to be listening. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much for those comments. This particular activity is a mapping exercise or a survey, but we would definitely encourage you to contribute as much as possible to the activity, as well as to all other activities, to reflect this important point about how to reflect the practices of Indigenous peoples in different processes. I'm just looking through the chat. There is a question from Panchali on the timeline for this particular activity, including with respect to submissions for the activity. We do not anticipate launching a second call for submissions for this particular activity, since we now need to focus on working on the technical paper for the activity. But if you would like to contribute to the technical paper, you can email the Secretariat. I think the address is lcipp@unfccc.int. Email them as soon as possible if you want to contribute in some manner to the technical paper. And I guess this can also go to Yon's comments as well, if you feel that your inputs might contribute to the technical paper. Just looking through the chat. Yes, I see Pasango. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Yo. I just, regarding earlier thoughts also, I just would like to highlight that if we have indigenous people's knowledge and our rights is been recognized in the climate change area, what would happen in relation to the climate change resilience. I just would like to highlight the one of the research done by the Right Resource Initiative, RRI, a very recent study that has been done in 42 countries. The 42 countries covering almost half of the world's lands, that shows like a 110 billion tons of above ground carbon stock in 3.15 billion hectares of land claimed by indigenous people and local communities. And that also shows like if we have now the trend of exclusionary conservation or protected area, that has been like investment of the government and also from other bodies, almost 4.3 to 5.1 trillion dollars. But the study shows because of the indigenous people, they have been contributing for sustainable management of the resources, biodiversity and ecosystem, that has already I mentioned earlier in my intervention also, that cost of recognizing indigenous people's knowledge and experiences of indigenous people in local communities, that would cost less than $30 billion. So from this study, I would like to highlight that how important it is to have a recognition of indigenous knowledge and cultural practices. So when you deal with these existing policies and practices, but the fact like in the global level now we start hearing this kind of at least through the platform we started have a forum for the discourse on the values of indigenous people. But if you see the other national level policy and programs, especially dealing with the climate change, we hardly see the recognition of the indigenous values and knowledge. The data of RRA already clearly shows having acknowledged the role and contribution, especially the knowledge, that would be really, really very best way of dealing with the climate change. So perhaps our policies and programs, especially inside and outside the constituent bodies, to consider on that one. Thank you, Will.
Thank you very much, Pasang. And I think that particular point on the involvement or the practices, the relevant practices for involvement of indigenous peoples and local communities at the national level can be very useful for activity 10, which will then in turn feed into activity 7 and others. Just looking through the chat once again, I think there's a question from Matilda about the next steps once the technical paper has been compiled. So as envisioned in the current concept note, the technical paper will be compiled and posted between now and the next FWG meeting. And then the FWG will meet in FWG 4 to consider and finalize the technical paper. And that will be it for this particular activity under this initial work plan for the LCIPP. If more work needs to be done on something like this, it'll probably have to be part of a new work plan beyond this initial work plan. And I did see, did you raise your hand, Andrea? Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes, I was just taking the opportunity to look again at the technical paper, and I actually have just a very specific question. On point 19, paragraph 19, it said 7% of references to indigenous peoples are related to engagement. And it says WEOG had the highest level of references to engagement. What are you, how does engagement be defined? Is this recommendations of theirs, or that indigenous peoples were engaged in the development of their NDCs? If you could clarify that definition of engagement, I guess is what I would like.
Thanks very much, Andrea. I believe this is the technical paper for activity 9 rather than activity 7, although I'm happy to.
Sorry.
So yeah, no, I have a million papers open on my desk as well. That's no problem.
Okay, all right. I'll wait till we're done. We're on that activity then. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an easy way for me to not answer that question.
But okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the floor, from the FWG members? And I do notice there's been a little bit of discussion in the chat as well about this issue of practices, good practices or best practices. So I think this is a useful point to keep in mind as the FWG moves forward in its consideration in this activity, including for the production of the technical paper for this activity. If there are no more comments from the members or from the floor or a particular question, if there are none, then I would like to close the discussion on this particular activity. We've taken note of all the comments in the chat as well. And move on to activity 9. Okay, so a little bit, okay, good. So activity 9 on the consideration and engagement of Indigenous peoples and local communities in policies and actions and communications under the convention. The co-leads for this particular activity are Hindu and Alik. This particular activity's concept note is online as well as a background note. There are a few other elements related to this, but I will allow, I believe, Hindu as the co-lead to give the update on this particular activity, including the timeline for future consideration by the FWG. So please, Hindu, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like firstly to thank my colleague Alik, who really have been helpful and who always leave the floors to Indigenous peoples. Then I think this is also the way of participation that allowed by government to Indigenous peoples. And I want also to thank the Secretariat for all the supports continuing that we are doing formally, informally, through all the social media. It's really have been a great experience working with you in these activities. So colleagues, activity 9 is about mapping the existing policies, action, and communication, including the NDCs, NAPs, and other relevant policies and communication under the convention with respect to whether and how they incorporate consideration and engagement of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And while these years, normally the SIPO years, are supposed to be the revision of the NDCs, so these activities take already the implementations in a right way. We didn't delay it at all. So the objective of these activities, it's to develop an inventory for the existing action and enable Indigenous peoples and local communities to actively contribute to the climate change adaptation and mitigation. And it is also to give the opportunities to the parties, to the non-state party actors to learn from the best practices to enhance collaboration and action and support the Indigenous peoples and the local communities, in particular in the context of this year, the SIPO year 2020, with the incoming version normally of the NDC's revisions, as I said earlier, and regarding to the COP15 that's postponed already, and of the CBDs and also of the climate change. And another objective for us is to encourage all the parties and non-party stakeholder actors to include Indigenous peoples and local communities to all the traditional knowledge and rights and all the adaptation and mitigations policies and documents. So for these activities, we work across several strategies through the submissions, through the survey, and many other document analysis, where the Secretariat played a big role under the leadership, of course, of Alik and myself. So so far the outcome that we have, we finalized the concept note, of course, that shared by Tiffany through the link for all of you. And we launched the call for submission, where we got a very little, like 5. And then at the end, like maybe the Secretariat get others, but it was not so productive. And we finalized the list of the policies and action and communication under the UNFCCC to analyze and add to the annex of this concept note. And this part, after my presentations, will be presented by the Secretariat. Then we make the outreach to the network to promote the call for the submissions, and we have been through many calls, for example, with the Permanent Forum, with the other UN agencies, and all the Secretariat join us to discuss with all the agencies to promote the call for submission in order to have it with the broader UN and non-UN organizations. And we come back with the survey, but the survey got more success action because we got over 255 response. And the survey have been translated to French, Spanish, and then the colleagues who couldn't get the chance to follow in English, they did that in the language that they understand better. And it was also not too long that making a paper of submission, so we got more peoples. And the Secretariat managed to map close to 1,000 documents on the climate change related to the conventions to map out the indigenous peoples and local communities mention or participation, and that also will be present later. So then we got also to produce a background document on the methodology for the mapping, and we produced the background document with an analysis of the submissions, and the Secretariat drafted the first version of the mandated technical paper. Of course, with the collaboration of the co-chairs and then the co-leads, and that will be that already also shared with all the facilitative working group members. So we got a lot of activities, and maybe it is the bigger activities and all the work plan that we had. So for us, the next step will be the technical paper that will come up, finalize it by the secretariats, and put it in the way that will be presented to the SAPSTA. And we will also work in the recommendation, consider it under the activity 6, as we discussed on it this morning, under the capacity for engagement, to develop recommendation for SAPSTA 55. So that will be the end of the work. I'm going to give the floor to the Secretariat to share the screen and show us a couple of slides that they prepare on how we did the activities. But before that, I would like really to thank Marcelo for all the work that he did, and also Jimmy for all the technical paper that you helped it to put all the ideas together and draft it. And thanks, Tiffany, for the coordination of all this. So thanks the co-chairs for also your input in all the work we are doing. I give the floor to Marcelo to make his presentation, and I think he gave it to Jimmy. And if my co-chair Alec have also to input before we give it back to you, Chair. Over to you, Marcelo.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, dear colleague Hindu. I already started sharing my screen. I hope you can see it. I will put it into full screen now. And without losing any time, including on referring to the respective decisions, as you all know as FWG members very well, what the decisions are for this activity 9. I will first start with a methodological approach we developed for activity 9. and then Jeremy will go into the draft technical paper itself. So without further ado, starting with the different types of documents we reviewed systematically in this activity 9, mapping of policies, actions, and communications under the convention in terms of consideration and engagement of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So there we identified from the Secretariat side, of course, with guidance from Coco and Tiffany, and also under the leadership of the co-leads Hindu and Alik, we identified 9 such reports, if you like. So from national determined contributions, NAPs, the National Adaptation Plans, the National Adaptation Programs of Action, the NAPAs, and long-term strategies, national communications. So we have a very comprehensive list of documents that we went through, as Hindu already mentioned, and there we developed an Excel database that captured not only these different types of policies in each of the worksheets, but also the 10 keywords that were used to do the search and core of the mapping of activity 9. So the keywords, of course, Indigenous and local communities, but also Indigenous knowledge, technologies, and practices, and the same for local communities. So we really did a very rigorous approach, scientific, if you like, starting with the data collection phase and then moving into data analysis, separate from each other. So at this first step was really about objective data collection from nearly 1,000 documents submitted by parties under the UNFCCC. And then we did an analysis in terms of consideration and engagement of Indigenous peoples and local communities in these policies, communications, and actions under the convention. So that was all captured in this large database very systematically. And just to come to the last slide, I would just mention that based on this analysis of this large database, we also did the analysis of submissions and the surveys to compile from these different sources the results into the draft technical paper that Jeremy will present. Before I pass to Jeremy, I would just very much would like to express the appreciation for all FWG members that helped reach out to the different regions to maximize the responses that we got from the Indigenous peoples representatives, local communities representatives, and of course from parties for this survey. So we produced a background document, so we not only responded to the mandate, but went beyond and produced background documents based on the survey and the submissions. So with that, I would like to now pass to Jeremy, who will talk about concretely the draft technical paper. Jeremy, the floor is yours, if the chair allows.
Oh, yes, please go ahead. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I just had some problems with my microphone. Thank you very much, Marcelo. So Marcelo's taken us through the methodology of the background analysis, and I'll just take us through the technical paper. Hindu has already given us the scope of the paper, an analysis of gaps in existing policies, actions, and communications under the convention. and whether and how they incorporate consideration and engagement of Indigenous peoples and local communities. The paper sets out the background analysis, the survey results, and the analysis of gaps. I'm going to focus on the analysis of gaps just out of time. But do come up with questions on anything else as well afterwards. So we identified 10 gaps that emerged from surveys, from submissions, and from the background analysis of these 9 different types of documents. I'll speak just a little bit more about some of them where the name may not be immediately explanatory as to what it is. So generally speaking, we found that there were low levels of engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities, insufficient capacity building for engagement, and unidirectional training. So where training occurred, perhaps it was in one direction from one group to another and not both ways. Engagement and consideration are not included throughout the process. So within one initiative or one project, Indigenous peoples or local communities may be consulted only in one phase, but not throughout. The need for continued engagement over time, so similar to the last gap, but this over a long period of time of different projects and initiatives or decision-making opportunities where Indigenous peoples and local communities were not engaged continually. The conceptualization of engagement with Indigenous peoples and our local communities as a resource rather than a process. So where engagement was seen as necessary to complete a process, but not specifically to co-create knowledge or to co-implement solutions. Okay, gap 7. Lack of collaboration to disseminate expertise-specific knowledge. So where there are groups of people with complementary knowledge, meetings were not always facilitated for them to share this knowledge the best way they know how. Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, and local knowledge are promoted without a supporting infrastructure to facilitate repeated engagement and accessibility. So this refers to where knowledge may be used in one instance, but not carried on throughout a process or through to other initiatives where it could also be engaged with. And the last two gaps sort of speak for themselves. A lack of references to Indigenous technologies and practices and considerations of gender in relation to Indigenous peoples and local communities were not included in those documents. Those are the 10 gaps we identified. Thank you very much. And I'll pass back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Jeremy and Marcelo, for these presentations. Chair, if you can allow it, I would like just to ask briefly our sister EE to give like a 1 minute presentation of how they did this submission to show how it was very participatory. But it's really up to you if you have 1 minute to allow it her.
I have no objection. I think that's fine. Please go ahead.
Thank you. EE, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share our views
Please
on
stop sharing the screen and then we can see all people's. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity to share our views on Activity 9 of the 2-year work plan. My name is Noimin, Director of Promotion of Indigenous and Nature Together Point, and I would like to share with FWG member the key highlight of AIPP, IGIA, NIFING, and Point submission made in September. Some good practices have evolved in Asia for the engagement of Indigenous people at national level, particularly in REP+ process. Despite this, there are a number of issues and challenges that Indigenous people are facing in the region. The first nationally determined contribution NDC submitted by at least 10 Asian states do not explicitly mention either rights of Indigenous people or human rights. There are restrictive policy in place to prohibit our traditional livelihood, such as shifting cultivation. This is facilitating the erosion of Indigenous knowledge, culture, and belief system of Indigenous people. Therefore, we recommend the UNFCCC parties to implement all UNFCCC decisions related to Indigenous people, ensure a human right-based approach to climate action in compliance with the UNDRIP and ILO Convention 169, recognize Indigenous people as partner in the protection of biodiversity, establish Indigenous people climate platform at national and local level, revise and implement nationally determined contribution, NDC with the full and effective participation of Indigenous people, including women, youth, and persons with disability. I will share the link of our submission, both in English and Spanish version, in the chat box for people who want to know more about our submission. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, EE. So that's just to show how we did the process, I mean, from our regions. So thank you so much, Chair. Over to you now.
Thank you very much, Hindu, the Secretariat as well for the presentations and the contribution from the floor. I would like to open up for a discussion, beginning with the FWG members, and I do see Andrea raising her hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is quite an impressive body of research here, and I think I'm going to have to read it a few times to absorb it. But going back to my question before, which was put at the wrong time, but I want to frame it in kind of a larger context. I'm seeing, on the chat from one of our co-chairs from our North America group, who's also the co-chair of the Indigenous Caucus, IPFFCC, the question about rights here. There's no mention, since the preamble of the Paris Agreement, as we all know, mentions both human rights and rights of Indigenous peoples. There's no mention here of how many of these reports actually mention rights, in particular rights of Indigenous peoples. And it was said by the Secretariat that was included if it was tied to Indigenous rights, but I may be missing it. I may be missing. I got up very early today. But maybe that could be clarified. And it relates to this bigger question, I think. I don't even like to see best practices, good practices or wise practices, founded on the rights safeguards and the rights framework that we have yet to actually codify, as we've mentioned before. And the more we talk about this, the more I really see that as a top priority, because there's no way that we can assess even good practices or wise practices or adequate practices without delineating what are the rights framework. And so back to my original question, I think it was a specific one on point 19 in here, where it says that Western Europe and other groups communicate the highest % of engagement with Indigenous peoples. But then throughout, it's saying engagement is interpreted by states as maybe a one-time meeting or a consultation, and not an ongoing process of implementation of climate policies and practices that take not just Indigenous knowledge and practices, but Indigenous rights as the framework. And I think that that may be a gap we want to identify, or maybe it needs to be included as a section here, like we have gender, etc. And I'll just end by saying my question was, how is engagement defined, and why are we using the word engagement, the right, per Article 18 of the UN Declaration is the right to participation, which we've always said does not mean presence in the room or a one-time so-called consultation, or, but what is the right to participation here? And why are we using engagement instead of participation when that is the minimum standard right per the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples by representatives chosen by Indigenous peoples, not the representatives chosen by states or who's invited to a consultation, etc. So, I think we need to look at that. And that was my original question. How do you define engagement? in this process, and why is the term engagement used rather than participation? I mean, maybe that's what we came up with in the original activity was the word engagement. I think it is, but you know, if we're talking about rights, we're talking about right to participate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Perhaps one of the co-leads would like to respond, and or the secretariat to her question. Hindu, would you like to respond? Or
Thank you, Andrea, for that. But I think you responded to your question by your last point, saying that we put the engagement. So we designed the work plan, and in the work plan we put the wording as. Thank you, Tiffany. I saw that Tiffany put the title that mapping existing policies, action, and communication, and then we also put like consideration and engagement. So as we put it and it have been adopted, we cannot change it now, but also we have to note that this activity is linked to the activity 6. So all what you said is very relevant to all of us, and we will use it by making the recommendations. And also to note that we analyze the existing policies and communications. It was over 1,000 documents that analyzed by the 10 wording that put it. If you put Indigenous, if there is right there, the right will come up immediately, and we will map Indigenous people's rights or Indigenous knowledge. So that how the analysis was over all the documents, and it showed it without any gap, all the documents. And I think also Jimmy's presented the gap that he figured out, and we will use all the 10 points of the gap, and we will add your point to this one to turn it into the recommendations. And I think it is our work as facilitative working group member to follow up on those recommendations to get implemented. But this is my understanding. I don't know if Alec have also to add, and then Tiffany will give you more clarification of how it can work technically. Ali? I don't know.
Thank you, Hindu. Well, and I agree with you, Andrea. You know, when I joined and when I started looking at the work plan, I was also thinking along the same lines that you are thinking, that instead of engagement, we should have couched it as participation. But I think at this stage, we can't do anything to change the work plan and the contents of the work plan. Maybe that should come as a recommendation, as Hindu put it.
Thank you very much.
I think Tiffany, if you allow it, Chair, may Tiffany just clarify technically this part, please?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Hindu. What we'll do is, which I mentioned in the chat as well, we'll make the database of information available to the FWG members or more broadly, so that others can also see what the mapping results were, in case you're interested in, for instance, other topics that were not listed as the scope of the paper in the work plan, but are still very, very relevant and important, and do feed into the other activity on recommendation. So we'll make that available for everyone to access. It's quite a big file. We'll have to figure out a way to do that, but we will make that open.
Thank you very much, Secretary Tiffany. And actually, I'd like to follow up a little bit on Andrea's question about paragraph 19 from the technical paper. On this issue of engagement. And from the draft technical paper, like Andrea said, the UN region that communicated the highest percentage of engagement with Indigenous peoples, according to the paper, is the WEOG region. I'm wondering if in putting together the technical paper, you took into consideration how things are in certain states. For example, in the Pacific, where the peoples there are, according to some, they're the indigenous peoples, or they're the first peoples. They're the ones in positions of power, but they don't necessarily reference themselves as indigenous peoples, but they're assumed to participate anyway, robustly in these processes. I'm wondering if that was taken into consideration in putting together this technical paper. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really interesting what you are saying here. I mean, personally, I'm also learning, but the technical paper is done by the Secretariat and they took into consideration this one. But just so your one sentence explaining to me better understanding of how Secretariat think about it and put it. But maybe, I don't know, Tiffany can add on this.
Yeah, thanks, Hindu. And the AOSIS submission on this is very, very excellent and was very valuable input to the technical paper. So what we did is we extracted some lessons from the AOSIS submission where this is mentioned, that in many, for instance, Pacific Island countries, the dominant population is indigenous or local community or both. And so this is highlighted in the technical paper. It wasn't very easy to take into account in the statistics, but we did put lots of mentions of that throughout the paper. But if you, I mean, this is a zero order draft, so if you can find better ways to reference it, then we can revise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see Daly, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. First, I'll say it's difficult to follow all these chat comments and the proceedings and look at the technical documents. Anyway, but I have noted a number of different comments specific to the analysis and the human rights framework that Indigenous peoples managed to put in place after a couple of decades. There's also now reference to by someone from SILE about the ILO Convention number 169 as an important international human rights instrument. And we all know that despite the fact that there are only 22 or so ratifications of the instrument, the ILO itself has recognized that ILO Convention number 169 is mutually reinforcing and complementary to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this just goes to the questions, the persistent questions from Graham Reed and potentially quite a few others. I can't see all of the chat comments, but the point being that within the UN FCCC and a host of its documents and resolutions and activities, that an analysis that just points to practices, technologies, but not a single reference or an explicit reference to whether or not parties have been responsive to the rights of Indigenous peoples in the context of climate change. And I think it does warrant some attention in terms of moving on from this point and not allowing for any gap. And this is this would be a significant gap if the overall intent is to actually be responsive to Indigenous peoples. This human rights framework for analysis, for critical analysis, is an important aspect of the work. The other comment is that I trust that, and I don't know how I missed the reference to integrating Indigenous knowledge. I would have shied away from that term. I don't know how I missed that in the original concept note, but in reading further with regard to this activity, it seems like the careful treatment of it, which is what we hope to reveal in activity 4, as far as Indigenous knowledge, the treatment of Indigenous knowledge, the co-production of knowledge. This dynamic could, in fact, chronologically, the activity should have maybe taken place in order to inform and infuse this particular activity, but that's water over the dam at this point. But so I just wanted to highlight those 2 points in terms of what I'm seeing in relation to the chat comments from a number of participants, but also my own concern about the significance of the human rights framework, a human rights lens, especially in relation to Indigenous peoples. Thank you. Sorry to be so long-winded.
No trouble at all. Thank you very much, Daly. I thought that was very helpful. And on that, one of your points on the rights dimension, especially in national policies, I think there's a chat comment from a Benjamin Shaker. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. There's been some ongoing research on references to rights in NDCs so far. And the research indicates that only a limited number of NDCs explicitly refer to the rights of Indigenous peoples, and he does have a listing there. So that might be something to be considered going forward. And I do note in the draft technical paper, there is a reference in the gaps analysis section to rights. There are a few references to rights there, I think, including a submission from Canada about the importance of considering rights going forward. Do I have any other hands for comments from the FWG members? Sam, please go ahead. And then Eli.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I just, I would like to just thank EE for her for the submission to the FWG regarding this regarding the activity 9. This is very important for Indigenous peoples, especially we all are working very hard at the global level to have our situation on the ground level. So it's a very the ground reality EE has presented in her submission in a joint collaboration with other organizations. That was very praiseworthy, and this kind of submission need to be done more so to highlight and to understand the ground reality, especially the policy that has that is the possibility of the impacts on our people on the ground. So the NDC, the national determined contribution, is very, very important because whatever we do on the grounds, there are always the contribution is there. But the Indigenous people who have been contributing for their generation for climate change adaptation and mitigation, the knowledge system, the experience, and then all our customary governance that contributed for resilience of the climate change, and even the data I mentioned you earlier, the amount of the carbon stock that contributed even above the ground and even below the ground, and even through their practices, that has been highly reflected in the NDC. I'm not surprised the finding of this study when you go through all these 255 response that you have mentioned, that low level of engagement, not sufficient capacity, and lack of collaboration, and the lack of reference to the Indigenous people technology is a very, very obvious, and it's not surprising. So so this data also clearly shows that FWG has a big responsibility how we deal with the state parties in the coming days, in the forthcoming, because I believe this this activity to understand the situation of Indigenous peoples, especially, and then from the finding of this study clearly shows the situation of Indigenous, how vulnerable situation of Indigenous peoples, and despite their engagements, and how they are hardly barely reflected and also highlighted by EE. And thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Pasang. Eli, please go ahead. And then Estebancio, I believe.
Thank you, Chair. This has actually been a really interesting discussion. And again, thanks for the co-leads on this. I'll actually pick up on 2 points that I've been hearing throughout. I think the first one is the technical issue, and I as well had some questions, and so I'm interested in seeing when the Secretariat gives us more information on that methodology. For example, I know others talked about, how are Indigenous rights searched in this in doing the exercise, and I also think like on the issue of like local communities, for example, I know that some NDCs or some BURs and so on may also talk about working with local and regional governments, and which might be different than local communities. So I wonder if that somehow got pulled up in the search, because when you're if you work with a municipality, it's not quite the same as saying, oh, that's a local community. So anyway, just to say that, also interested in seeing how the methodology was done. On the broader question, and some of you raised this on how are we using the term engagement and why engagement versus other terms and so on. From my perspective, I think engagement is actually a good term to use in the sense that it is probably among the broadest of terms we can use here. And there's quite a large spectrum of engagement from, well, there's also no engagement, but in terms of engagement itself, you can have one-way communication, which is not, I would say, a best practice, but it's a form of engagement. Then you can have engagement that's based on a rights framework. You can have an engagement that's based on full participation and decision-making. So I think using the word engagement is actually good in that sense. And part of what we're doing in this exercise is trying to understand the broad spectrum of engagement that is happening across across the world. And I think that understanding will then help us start identifying where the gaps are. And I know folks are not quite comfortable with the best practices, but I think by seeing this spectrum and seeing what we're hearing, not just from parties, but what we're hearing from Indigenous peoples, then we're going to get that better understanding. Oh, okay, well, there's this kind of engagement and there's this kind of engagement. And I think we want to lean more towards a certain kind. So I think this is actually, so from my perspective, it's not a bad word to be using. I hope that's helpful. But yeah, again, I think, we're not going to come up with a one size fits all. All this activity is linked to activity 4, activity 6, they're all interlinked. And I think we are doing all this work to build our capacity to first understand how everything's working, understand what is working and what isn't, and as we keep taking steps forward as a group. So that's kind of just an overall comment, but I'm really finding this actually quite interesting. Thanks for everyone's contributions.
Thank you very much, Eli. I believe Estebancio asked for the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and all the rest of the groups who have been expressing the ideas and input. To go back to the marriage, when was starting, and I remember 2 things. There were 3 parties had reference to the rights, the collective rights, and people's rights. Only 3. Now we have probably 5 or 6, according to Benjamin case study. At least has been 3. Oh no, it's unstable. The thing is, we still having this issue now, because when we started in Macarage, they were saying something that NDC or the draft this refers to Indigenous people's territories and or resources. And I remember we asked them why not, and they say do them. We come at definition, we are, and I said, what's that mean? They say, no, we invite them to our meetings and they are present. And I say, it is why we take into account the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peoples. We thought that we have the right to have a full and effective participation, not the point that we're gonna be listening whatever saying at national level, but we are not contributing really if we don't have a full and effective participation. But we are engaged, yes, we are engaged, but we are not saying anything. So that's why probably many people who have been in this process feel a bit concerned with the definition of the engagement, exactly engagement. The other things that I would like to talk about this doesn't want to use actually in many Latin American forest issue because indigenous peoples they have forests in their territory and they believe that they are not contributing. But I say that they maintain and they, then for us I think that it stays more than the reference of the collective right, indigenous people rights. Because if not, then what we have been saying here about safeguarding indigenous community maybe doesn't more in the future because we are not providing exact definition. Now, about the history, we're talking about Macarel, so I think that is 6 years ago, and we have improved or enhanced the participation people in many countries. I hope that that's going to change, and Latin American was important to see and how it works. Now, I think is that it's a question or secretary to the colleagues is French and the rest of the language because we need questions and I know that we don't have, we only have 4 minutes left, but sorry for that. So here I think that because most of the area and they say that wanted to refer as well. So I'm just going to stop. Thank you, Yori, for
that. Thank you very much, Esteban. So you were breaking up, at least for me, quite a bit. And I think you may have asked the question toward the end. You might want to type it in the chat just in case the person you were addressing didn't capture that. If you can just type it in the chat, please. Thank you. And I believe, who else?
No, you're right. I mean, I haven't unstable internet at the moment, maybe because it's rain and that's happened here. So sorry for that. Apologies.
No problem. I'm from the islands. When it rains in my island, my internet connection goes bad as well. And I believe Pasang had her hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah.
And then Andrea, yes.
Thank you. I will be very short considering the time we have now. Just regarding the engagement, I also would like to highlight a little bit. Thank you, Elias, for your thoughts on sharing. When you do the survey, especially like when this kind of policies survey is going on, most of the policies that is happening on the national level, like a NDC, even NAVs, most of the time they are more based on the secondary data. So when they are depending more on secondary data, the engagement of indigenous peoples is far away, right? So most of the time the concerns of indigenous people or documentation on the indigenous people is hardly there. So when the national level, the policy, especially the NDC or NAPS or even adaptation company, like all other kind of any kind of relevant policies, all are most of the time they are depending on secondary data. That was a very challenges for indigenous peoples. Even even we think about the engagements when they are depending on secondary data, hardly few maybe on the kind of national labels, so one time participation. So how we consider that part of from the perspective of engagements, and I also agree on that part with Andrea. But one of the challenges I see in this survey is like when they are depending on secondary data. So I think we need to also think about it, like how do we think about it, the concept of engagements when most of the policies are more depending on secondary data and not the primary data. And at least if there was a kind of a link to the primary data, at least there kind of a connection with the indigenous people. But when they are depending on secondary data, we hardly have any data on the regarding to indigenous people's rights or issues or concerns. So I just would like to highlight that part when you think about it, engagements. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Pasang. Andrea, please go ahead. You're on mute.
I'm doing.
Yeah.
I do understand and agree with Elias's point about using the term engagement, because engagement is not necessarily the rights framework, but it also leaves a lot of room for when there is, I guess you could call, engagement without the real right of participation in decisions that affect our rights, which is the minimum standard in the Declaration, without that being upheld. So I think all of this really adds to the need, that Daly raised and others have in the chat, for that rights framework or the rights basis or the rights lens, to look at what are considered, I won't even say, we don't use best or even good, but adequate or acceptable or rights-based practices for all of these matters, including, quote, engagement, which for us is the minimum standard right, called right to participation in decision-making in matters which would affect our rights. So, and there's a lot going on that is less than that. And I think somehow it might be good to, have a rights section in this paper. And I thought Benjamin from the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, his points about how few states actually mentioned Indigenous rights. They maybe mentioned Indigenous, but Indigenous rights in their NDCs was something important and could be highlighted in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We are running a bit behind time, but I do see Daly asking for the floor. Please go ahead.
I'll just be very quick. It might be an opportunity for us, because of all this dialogue and discussion about rights, and thank you, Eli and Tiffany in particular, for posting some of the submissions where there is reference, that in terms of the UNFCCC as an international treaty, and to my knowledge, without any kind of really stringent review process similar to the Universal Periodic Review within the Human Rights Council, that one potential opportunity we have here with the focus upon rights is, of course, keep the pressure on and being hyper vigilant about it in the context of the UNFCCC, but for possibly the FWG as a constituted body of the within the UNFCCC to make a recommendation to the Human Rights Council to request and review information specific to impacts of climate change on the human rights of Indigenous peoples in relation to the Universal Periodic Review. I'm just thinking off of the top of my head, and it's something that we can follow up on within the FWG. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daly. Since we're just about out of time, and I do not see anyone from the FWG asking for the floor, I'd like to open up the floor very briefly to the rest of the participants. If you would like to share any comments, I do note that the very active discussion in the chat as well. And I hope we've addressed most of them, if not all of the comments on this particular point. And I do see Estebancio. I think the question that I was not able to get was, I think he asked whether a Spanish translation of some of these materials might be available, and that might be something for the Secretariat to address. But just to open up the floor again to participants, to the broader participant list. I'll give you a few
while
seconds.
you're waiting for hands, I can clarify Estebancio's question. All of the documents that are listed in the work plan, including this technical paper, they're official documents, so they will be translated once the FWG has considered and agreed to them. And to Daly's question on the review processes, not specific to rights, but under the UNFCCC process, there's the periodic review, which reviews the adequacy of the global temperature goal and also progress towards attaining it. And there's also the upcoming global stocktake, which looks at progress towards the Paris Agreement. But it's not specific to rights.
Great, thank you very much. I do not see any requests from the floor. No. Okay, great. Thank you very much, colleagues, everyone, for your participation.
So there is no any request to floor. There was also another questions on the chat for the follow-up of these specific activities, what will be done. So then Grams is asking, it will be interesting to see this conversation, how we can identify the gap. I mean, all those gaps, how we can analyze them and update them in the current NDCs 2020. And then I think maybe these questions will be going directly to the Secretariat. If we have the timeline of the NDCs revisions, if it's going to be to next year or it's going to end by this years, so that can help us as the co-lead of these activities to follow up and see how we can reformulate a recommendation in order to impact this current revision of the NDCs to do not delay. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Hindu. And I note that the output timeline for this activity is for FWG4, including the set of recommendations. So I'm wondering if the Secretariat can clarify whether that would be too late, I guess, to influence the updating of NDCs. If the Secretariat would like to clarify. If not,
a lot of the
NDCs,
yeah, a lot of the NDCs have already been updated and the updates are being submitted, but not all of them have been submitted. I can follow up, Hindu, and let you know what is the exact timeline for that.
All right, thank you very much. I do not see any more comments or hands. So thank you very much, colleagues. I thought this was a very rich and useful discussion that we've had today. All points definitely well noted and will be well considered going forward by the FWG with the very able assistance of the Secretariat. Thank you very much to the Secretariat as well for your great work. Before I close today's meeting, if Andrea, my fellow co-chair, do you have any closing comments?
Just to say that I think there's a solid consensus about developing further this rights framework, rights safeguards, criteria, using rights for, if we're calling them good practices or wise practices, all of these is really a cross-cutting concern. And I appreciate the richness of the input from my fellow members as well as from the participants. I think it's given us a lot to think about of how to move forward on this, including based on the original proposal from Estebancio and I to start to circulate some regional inputs along these lines as part of the agreed outcomes from our activity too. So I just would like to consider to talk about that a little bit more as we move on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And before I close the meeting, I'd like to turn it over to the Secretariat if you would wish to discuss, especially tomorrow's breakout groups and the modality for that particular engagement.
Good.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Yo. So tomorrow, as you can see on the schedule, after the 20-minute break, there will be an agenda item number 5 on enhancing the coherence of the actions of the LCIPP. And tomorrow, that agenda item deals specifically with relevant processes of bodies under the convention. That's going to be held in breakout groups, 2 parallel breakout groups on the same topic. And the breakout groups will allow more people to discuss and have a say, because it'll give more people more time. We are randomly allocating people to those breakout groups. We have to do it in advance, according to Zoom. And so if anybody has one breakout group will have French interpretation, but it'll be conducted in English. And the other breakout group, the same, will conduct it in English, but it will have Spanish interpretation. So if there's any participant or FWG member that has a specific requirement for interpretation, just let us know which of those groups you'd like to be in. And you can please do that either by chat here, which we will note, or you can send it by email to lcipp@unfccc.int. And then we'll take that into account. Otherwise, we're going to just divide everybody and put you into a different group. For those FWG members that have a particular interest in being in the same group as, for instance, a CBD or something, we've already noted those. But if you'd like to send that to us again, just also email me that, and we'll make sure that you're in the right group that you want to be in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. And seeing no further requests, Andrea, go ahead, please.
A question for Tiffany. Do you want us to stay on afterwards like we did yesterday just to talk about the arrangements for tomorrow?
Yes, if the co-chairs and the vice co-chairs can stay on, we'll send you to a small room for a briefing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. All right, thank you very much, everyone. On behalf of my co-chair and the rest of the FWG, I'd like to call an end to today's meeting, but please, we hope to see you again tomorrow at the same time, same place. Take care, everyone.
Thank
Oh,
you.
sorry. Hold on. I'm very sorry. Someone has a hand raised, I've been told.
No, you was just saying thank you.
Okay, someone was waving to me. Sorry.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you. Bye.
Today.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Marcelo. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.